So let's say that you are interested in doing research in these type of contexts, right? So you're interested in perhaps somewhat unique individuals, and you want to be able to better understand those individuals in their unique situations. Or you want to do research on a topic for which, well, not a lot of information is already known, right? So there's no theories about it, there's no prior research on it. It's about events that occur just once. Or you want to have the ability of immediately intervening. So you're, for example, doing interviews with young males that might be at risk of radicalization, right? So you want to do some interviews with them, but you also want to have the possibility to interfere, because the consequences of when they do radicalize during the time frame of your research might be severe. Or there are other ethical and practical considerations that play a major role in how you could do research, right? Is it suitable to, when a person is dying, for example, and you want to understand their experience, is it suitable to give them a battery of pre-formulated questions? Or is it more ethical to start out with their experience instead and have a more open perspective? Immediately changing thing applies to the individual. So you could say, in general, there's not a lot of generalizability here, right? So you're talking to an individual, and that person is talking about, I don't know, wearing a bomb vest tomorrow when the person is going to school, or anything else that has you worried. Then you can intervene, but you're not intervening in radicalization and terrorism in general. No, you're intervening there. You're basically informing the police or talking to that individual, perhaps to change their minds. So that's what I mean, in the sense of, we want the ability to interact and with the subjects of the research, and in that such situations, a qualitative approach might be more suitable. Of course, if you're doing research into persons that are special or contexts that are unique, there's a lack of generalizability there as well. I mean, qualitative research allows you to better perhaps understand their situation, which doesn't necessarily mean that you better understand the situation of other people that you're interested in as well. So in that sense, it's about those individuals, basically, in all of these examples. But let's say this has caught your interest, and you're one of these situations applies to you, and then you decide to do either a semi-structured interview, as we talked about, or you do a focus group, which is basically a group interview, but you also focus on the interaction within the people in the group, so how they respond to each other and how they talk to each other about the topics and their experiences. Or you do a content analysis, basically how people write or tweet or write to each other about their experiences, and you can try to get a general description or understanding of how they talk about their experiences there as well. So we have these interests, and we decide to do use these types of research tools. Then the question is, how do you go about this? And of course, this has been a lengthy course, and I can't explain to you in half a lecture how to do qualitative research as well. And as I indicated at the beginning, it's just to give you the gist of these approaches and to have a look at what we can take on board of the qualitative approach into these type of questions that we might take on board and add to our toolkit as general researchers, not necessarily quantitative researchers or qualitative researchers, just general tools for doing research that are useful. So we're going to look at 3 different approaches to doing qualitative research. And they're not systematic in the way that you're used to, right? So these are all answer-driven approaches, as we talked about them. But they are informative, and they highlight different aspects of qualitative research in general, specifically how people deal with their experiences or experience with things, how qualitative research can work more bottom-up instead of top-down in how we formulate theory, and how people talk about their experiences in discursive analysis. We're going to start with how people make sense of their experiences which is listed here as the second one, but this is going to be the first one. So IPA, interpretative phenomenological analysis. I'm sorry, I'm a bit struggling. I need some coffee. This is the first one we're going to cover. So basically, the focus of this approach to qualitative research is on how individuals give meaning to events. So what it's like for them to experience the stuff that's happening through them. But that also applies to the researcher. So in this qualitative research in general, but especially in IPA, you need to be aware of your role as a researcher in how you interpret the experience described by the subject in your research. So basically, you're trying to make sense of how somebody else is trying to make sense of the world. Double hermeneutic, if you will. You can instantly forget that term, but that's basically what's happening. So you need to be aware of your role in the context of the research and how you might be influencing the participants in the research as well, right? So and you need to be very explicit in how you write down your results, how your your framework of understanding, the way you view the world, basically interacted with how the participant viewed the world as well. So a focus on how we give meaning to events, both in the participant as well as the researchers, and how they are combined. And for example, you could be interested in how a woman's sense of identity might change during the transition to motherhood. How do young psychotic people experience and interpret romantic relationships? These are types of research that have been done, and you can see the focus on the experience, what it's like for a certain individual in a certain situation, as the focus of this type of analysis. Oh, I'm sorry. So basically what you would do, it looks perhaps already familiar on basis of what we described. These would basically be a description of the steps you would take in this type of approach. So there's not a random sample, but you get a targeted collection of a very homogeneous group. So to the individuals in the group are in a similar situation. And it's a small sample because the description that you're going to offer is very rich, as we talked about, right? So there's a lot to describe, and there's a lot of information covered in the transcript that you need to analyze. So getting that rich a description of a lot of individuals requires very vast amounts of time. So usually the samples are very small in qualitative research. You do an interview based on a global guideline, right? So it's the semi-structured interviews, and then you make a transcription, you annotate the description, you take notes, and you try to get a clustering of themes that play a role. And from that, you try to distill overarching themes, so general things that play a role in the way in which people talk about their experiences. For example, this is from, I think it's a therapeutic interview. So basically, it would just be an example of taking the steps from the transcript to the annotations to the description of the themes that researchers notice in the transcript. So you're interviewing, asking a question to Debbie in this case, not her real name. Can you tell me something about an argument with your sister? Well, I've got a system. I mean, I do it now. I always wash glasses. So she describes the situation, and then she talks about the interaction. She describes how she lost her temper, and I was so angry with her, and I just sort of pinned her to the wall and started slamming her head against the wall to see how she felt like, to see what it felt like to her. So it's a description of a violent interaction between an individual and another person, and you've done the interview and you've written it down in the transcript, and you read it, and the first round might be taking notes, right? So you see that the person loses her anger and she becomes angry very quickly. There's a role reversal, right? So now I am the aggressor instead of my sister. There's physical aggression, and she talks about wanting her sister to feel the same. In the next round, you might be trying to distill on the basis of this excerpt, but the whole interview as well, what type of themes are recurring in their descriptions. So what more generalized descriptions would cover what the things described in the transcript as well. In this case, the researchers landed on the descriptions of rapid emotional shift into anger, which is something that returned in multiple places in the transcript. She talked a lot about different power dynamics in how she described her experiences, and she talked a lot about physical aggression in how she described her experiences. So this is basically an example of taking these steps, right? So we're going from the top to the bottom, from the sample to the interview to the transcription, annotation, and clustering of themes. That's basically the steps illustrated here. Which you can categorize in superordinate themes as well. So general themes that cover or are informative about different parts of the transcripts. So in a lot of transcripts, the description of different forms of aggression return. There's a lot of talk about the experience of anger, and there's a lot of talk about the relationship between the self and others. So in the write down, you will relate your conclusions or your insights to these superordinate themes. Before we move on, indeed, and we'll talk about going back to the data or new data on the basis of the categories that you've formed in this inductive phase, which could indeed be a next step in your research. I just want to point out what we can take on board from this as researchers in general, right? So what's very explicit in this approach, in the IPA approach to doing research, is the acknowledgement of the active role of the researcher in doing the research. So it's not saying, well, I'm just a person holding the thermometer, right? So I'm just a person applying the measurement tools. No, you're basically saying, I have an active role in interacting with this participant or subject, and in that way, I'm actively shaping basically what happens in a research situation as well. That's why a qualitative researcher must show reflexivity in the research, be basically transparent about their position, their speaking position, their position of interpretation in how they interact with the subject. And that's given a lot of emphasis in qualitative research, not so much in quantitative research. Basically, that could be a criticism of quantitative research, is that your subjectivity should be swept under the rug, right? You should be as objective as possible, and the conclusions you draw should be completely independent of you as a specific individual. But perhaps, and we're going to look at that might be more difficult to differentiate from each other, your specific subjective experience and the stuff you're doing research in and you want to draw conclusions on, than we might think. And perhaps it's useful, even as quantitative researchers, to be more acknowledging of our perspective and the influence that we might have on the actual research. All right, so we talked about IPA. We've seen that there's a general focus on people's experience and basically people's first-person perspective that we try to understand, but we can only see through the first-person perspective of the researcher, which is something we need to acknowledge and we need to be open about. And that might be one of the things or the tools that we can take on board in research in general, is the fact that we look at the data, at the relevant situation through our personal lens. As mentioned just now, getting general descriptions of the themes that are talked about in an interview isn't the only step that you take in qualitative research. It could be, it could not be that there's a different approach can be described using grounded theory. Grounded theory was developed by Glaser and Strauss because they thought they were in that situation we just mentioned, right? So there's not a lot of research. It's a delicate situation because we want to understand what the experience of people dying in care homes is like. And we don't really know a lot about it because basically back in that day, people didn't talk about this. The doctors didn't talk about it as well. So things has changed somewhat in that doctors are more open to their patients about what is happening to them. But back in the day, people didn't talk to their patients about the medical process they were in or that they might be about to die. That was all very much inconvenient to talk about. So in that situation, it was a new situation and there wasn't a lot of theory that you could derive hypotheses from, that you could test in comparing groups. And that might even not be applicable in this sensitive a situation. So that's why they developed their own approach, which they called grounded theory, which again might be considered more of a general framework because there's different variations within the framework of ground theory as well. But again, if you're interested in these kind of questions, so the sensitive topics and topics that we don't know a lot about going in, then ground theory might be an approach that's useful. That might kind of look like this. And the main difference that I want to stress here in this very limited section about qualitative research is that there's going back and forth between the collecting and transcribing of data and the forming of categories, right? So you're basically not starting with a theory, but you're deriving a theory from the data you've collected, and then you go back to the data to basically test the categories you have. And in going back and forth, you're trying to refine the categories or your description or coding of the data to see whether it actually applies to most of the stuff happening in the transcript. So again, perhaps you're doing a semi-structured interview, which you try to code into, try to code and put into, assign to different categories. So you're trying to identify and label the meaningful units of text until saturation occurs. So saturation means that basically with the sets of codes and categories I currently have, that covers everything. There's nothing happening in the transcript anymore that isn't covered by any of these categories, which means that you need to go back and forth, right? So you derive a category from the part of the transcript, and then you go back and have another look at the full transcript to see whether that indeed covers everything, which is the testing of the categories and the testing of the interrelations between the categories that you suppose are happening. So basically, you're developing the theory from the data that you've derived. It might look, this is a specific example, which doesn't necessarily apply to all examples of qualitative research. This is a person, an individual talking about food and the importance of food within her culture. And again, you have an excerpt from a transcript, which you try to assign to open codes. So intermediate stage of coding, right? So there's talk about beliefs about digestion, about food therapy, about medicine and problems related to taking medicine. And going back and forth between the codes and the excerpt, you might get to more revised codes. Well, similar to the themes we just talked about, which might cover the data to a larger extent. So food is an essential therapeutic tool. Ambivalence towards medicine might be more general codes that you can test against the rest of the transcript. All right. So basically, if you want to summarize it, it's similar to what we just talked about, but it adds a new element. It adds going bottom up, or it emphasizes going bottom up from the data to the theory. You don't start with a crystal clear idea about what it's like for people in this situation. No, you basically acknowledge that you don't know yet, and you're trying to make sense of what could be a more general description of what it's like to be in that situation by deriving that from the data in a bottom-up fashion, and then testing it again against the data and going back and forth. That's the second thing that we could acknowledge as quantitative researchers, right? If you want to categorize yourself as such, is that perhaps we're overly focused on that top-down way of thinking about the relationship between theory and data, and deriving predictions from our theory and testing that against the data as a one-way ticket, basically. And perhaps we should be more interested in going about this bottom-up, starting with an open idea of, I don't know what might be interested here, and I'm just going to do an exploratory study. Right? I'm not going to test any hypotheses. I just have a couple of questions I'm interested in, and I'm going to try and derive a general description of what's happening from the actual data. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do that in a qualitative way, but it's something that you could acknowledge, at least even as a quantitative researcher, that perhaps that's something that we need to be more engaged in doing exploratory research, in going bottom up instead of top down, reasoning about our data in that way. All right, so we've looked at two perspectives on qualitative research and things we can take away from that. The IPA and the focus on that first-person perspective, both of the researcher as well as the participant, and the going back and forth between the theory and data. and the uses of that bottom-up reasoning from your data instead of top-down, which has gotten the emphasis so far in your education. Finally, before the break, bear with me, we're almost there, is a third approach I wanted to highlight and from which we can derive some ideas. So, the approach I want to talk about is discourse analysis. And the reason why I want to talk about discourse analysis is because it's very different from what you're used to when we talk about research, even more so than the two different approaches that we just covered. Discourse analysis has a more focus on how people basically talk about their experiences. It's not about getting an idea of what that experience is actually like. No, it's basically about the use of language itself. So how do people create a discourse on a given topic and their role within that discourse? It's basically the question about how is the stage set and how do people and how they use language and how they talk about other people, how do they assign them different roles and different degrees of power basically in that description of reality. In that way, social reality is constructed by the way in which we talk about reality, and that is what discourse analysis focus on. How do people construct their social reality on the basis of the way they talk about it? An example could be drapetomania, right? So drapetomania would be considered a disease if we go back 100 years or so, perhaps even more, because drapetomania was the unfortunate tendency that the slave had, that they wanted to flee the plantation. And that wouldn't be considered a healthy impulse by the slave, right? You don't want to be oppressed and you don't want to be on a plantation anymore, so you decide to flee. No, it was considered a mental disease, drapetomania, from mania, the illness and the intention to flee, which is a weird way to talk about slaves wanting to flee their captivity, right? But it was considered a disease back in the day, and we wouldn't consider it a disease now. In a similar way, sexual orientation, we're more tempted to consider that as a personality trait, right? It's a property of the individual. It's not, which is a different way of talking about sexuality than what's historically different from how people used to talk about sexuality. Sexuality used to be something that you did, right? It's how the way in which you engage with different types of individuals. It's not a characteristic of you as an individual. That way of talking about sexual orientation is something that arose over the past couple of years, past couple of decades, but it isn't a fixed way of talking about sexuality. Talking about depression as a brain disorder might be a weird way of talking about depression as well. It's something that we covered in this course, right? So is it the characteristic of misfiring in your brain, or is it just a collection of symptoms that might or might not be useful? So if we talk about these different diseases, mental illnesses, characteristics of personality, I use these examples because it's more evident to us that these are changing categories, that the way in which we talk about our experiences changes over time, and that the way in which we talk about people's experiences and people's situation in life, the way in which we socially construct our social reality, is informative. Right? It informs us in a way about the situation on that plantation, that people saw the tendency to flee by a slave as a disease and not a very natural impulse, as we might consider it to be now. So basically, the way in which we label experiences changes over time, and we can study that by using discourse analysis. So it's research about how people talk about their thoughts and feelings and experiences, not especially about whether that's how they really feel. No, it's about how does that way of changing, creating that discourse change over time, and how do people basically, by creating that narrative, assign people different roles and put them basically in that social construction in more powerful or subservient positions. And there's basically no single method for going about this, but people in general while applying discourse analysis are interested in what these constructions are like. So how do people talk about the experiences, and how they construct their social experiences? What is the role of the speaker, right? So if you, as a plantation owner, basically talked about the fleeing slave in terms of drapetomania, what is your role, right? So it's basically putting yourself above another human being, but justifying that by talking about illness instead of natural tendencies to not be in captivity. And what are the benefits for that speaker in that situation and in that construction, which might be informative as well? Which brings us to the third and final tool that we can add to our toolkit on the basis of this short description of different approaches to qualitative research, which is that we can differ somewhat in how we, basically how we approach reality. So we can take a more realist stance that there's an objective reality, and research allows us to get insight into that objective reality. Or we can be more relativistic in our approaches, and put an emphasis on the fact that people create their own reality in how they talk about it and engage with each other. And of course, a researcher participates in that construction, social construction of reality, in doing the research and doing the write-up as well. Which is something that we can take on board, especially as psychologists. At the very least, if it doesn't make us want to do this type of research, it should make us critical about the reality of the constructs we talk about, right? So you should be critical if you talk about depression, or if you talk about sexual orientation. You should be aware that that might be your way of constructing reality, and that you have an active role in said construction of reality, instead of it being a fixed objective aspect of reality, which realism wants us to believe, right? So it's basically the difference between considering depression real in the same sense as we consider a chair to be real and measurable, and considering depression as a label for a type of behavior, and the behavior as well as the label itself might change over time. So 3 different approaches to research, qualitative research, in which I've tried to emphasize different aspects that are emphasized to a larger degree in qualitative research than in quantitative research. So we talked about IPA, grounded theory, and discourse analysis, and we've emphasized the first-person perspective, the bottom-up way of reasoning about data, and the social construction of reality in the way in which people talk about their experiences. It might not be for you, this type of research, and we're going to have a critical perspective on it. At least I'm going to offer you my critical perspective of qualitative research in general after the break. But there are 3 things that we can take on board from this, which is the question to what degree we have an active influence, or subjective perspective as a researcher has an active influence on what's happening in research, the changing nature of the psychological categories or constructs we talk about, and the way in which we should be more concerned with exploratory research than we currently are. All right, that's it.